So I'm Hermione Lee, and I'm not going to tell you anything about Tom Stoppard, the titles of his plays, the lists of his honours, the reasons we all admire him. But I do want to say that I feel extremely lucky, and I think all of us feel extremely lucky and privileged to be able to spend some time in his company during his tenure this week of the Humanitas chair. Yesterday, I'm sure many of you were at his talk yesterday, you spoke about George Weidenfeld with the adjective magnanimous, and I think the adjective can be reapplied to you.
Oh, thank you.
So since we're here in Oxford, I would like to ask you some questions about the past. And I can't think of a better place to start than with your memory of a key moment in your history, which is the student production of Rosencrantz and Guildenstern that was put on by the Oxford Theatre Group in Edinburgh almost exactly 50 years ago in August 1966. And I know you've talked about this and written about this many times, but what are your memories of that now?
I could begin a pace or two back from that because Trevor Nunn told me something which I either never knew or had forgotten about how we got to that point. Trevor Nunn was a young director, associate or assistant or some such a title under Peter Hall at the RSC, 1965. And somehow or other, the RSC, well, they received a donation to put on 3 plays, I think it was, in a kind of satellite house down Kingsway, not very far from the Aldwych, where the Royal Shakespeare Company had its London base. Am I loud enough? And so on. And one of the 3 plays they chose was a play I'd sent in, which was Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead. And the lit manager, I guess, Jeremy Brooks, I think he was called, anyway, they said, oh, well, we'll do this. And Peter, I think, gave it to Trevor to do. So it was sort of going to be my big chance and Trevor's big chance, because I don't know that he'd actually done a solo production there. But anyway, this pot of money disappeared. I didn't find out until much later, quite recently, that actually what happened was that the RSC needed it more. They had other uses for it. And so it got drawn back into the kitty. So this little season went down a plug hole.
Yeah.
And the Royal Shakespeare Company, possibly through Jeremy Brooks, who was the kind of dramaturg figure, passed it to, do you remember Frank Hawser? You know, you don't. You're far too young. He ran the Oxford Playhouse. And in 1965 or 6, Frank Hawser said, well, there's this play, we can't do it anymore. Have a look at it. And Hawser gave it to OTG,
Right.
who then took it to Edinburgh.
And how did that go?
In The Sun Also Rises, Mike Campbell says that he went broke 2 ways, slowly and suddenly. Well, I think there was a decentish sort of audience. Well, first of all, I went up there while they were rehearsing, and for some reason the director departed, and I'm not sure, I can't remember now who took over, but I helped, which is to say I interfered. One of the ways I interfered was to point out that some pages had been duplicated twice, and with a very moving show of fidelity, a kind of moving demonstration of their faith in my cutting edgeness, they just did them twice. Or they were rehearsing them as sequential things. So it was all quite sort of amusing.
Ophelia, the person who played Ophelia, I was talking to, said...
Janice.
She said... what was that? She said they thought it was just modern drama when they got this stuff redone.
Yeah, they just thought, well, that's the way theatre is nowadays. The theatre of the absurd, but this turned out to be the theatre of the ludicrous. And Janet Watts, she ended up as a Guardian journalist, a distinguished journalist on the Guardian. Rosencrantz was a lawyer. He did law, and I don't really remember very much about the other people. Should I go on a bit or not?
Go on a bit about it. It's good.
Well, there was my play, and there was a late night cabaret, and the main person in the late night cabaret was Mick Sadler, who was completely brilliant, absolutely brilliant, and he did actually write some plays, radio plays, I think. And then he went to live in France and married a French girl and basically started writing in French instead of English. And I actually ran into him, I don't know, a few years ago now. And the woman, I think she was the only woman in this quartet of late night cabaret, was Diana Quick, whom you all know. So it was a very nice and interesting crossroads for a number of people.
But until that extraordinary review happened, which was the Ronald Brydon review in The Observer, when everything changed overnight, as it were, it had been just a small production in a hall.
It was a small production in a church hall, which no longer exists. I went looking for it years later. And I was sort of walking away from the theatre with the actors or somebody, and I knew Ronald Brydon actually, who was the critic, because he'd been editing a magazine in which I had a short story or two published a few years earlier. And he sort of looked round as he walked away, sort of slightly quizzically, and it must have been a Saturday night. I don't know. No, it couldn't have been a Saturday night, because on the Sunday I had to go back to London, and on the train I read this review, which was really, sort of very gratifying. And when I got to London, maybe a day or two later, I got a telegram. We had telegrams. What you could do is you could text somebody, and a person on a bicycle delivered your text. Not exactly a penny farthing, but it might as well have been. From the National Theatre, from Ken Tynan, asking to see the script or see me or something. And that must have been 50 years ago in August.
Yes, so you had been working for a long time. You'd been a journalist, you'd been writing all kinds of plays, you'd had things put on. Then there was this student production, then it got taken up and taken to the National. Everything completely changed. I mean, this is a well-known story, but it's interesting to ask you about it now, 50 years on. So do you think that astonishing moment of success, where then, you were the Tom Stoppard that people knew, do you think that was liberating to you and kind of empowering, or did it create sort of burden of expectation? I mean, when you look back on that change now, how does it feel to you now?
Well, I was married with a child. In fact, mirabile dictu, my eldest son is 50. He was 50 in May, so there you are. He was 3 months old or 4 months old. And I had to earn a living. So I think it's fair to say that the sort of instant feeling was that I didn't have to scrabble to suddenly pay the rent or whatever. So that was nice, because it wasn't a lot of money, but it was a lot to me. So I could relax on that front a bit. And then life became a bit too exciting in the sense that the play was then taken up by an American producer to do in New York, and we all went to New York on the Queen Mary, and on the boat was John Borman and his family, also going to New York. I can't remember why. And then we were in New York for quite a while, and then the play opened in New York, and that went well. It was all a bit unreal, really.
So did you immediately start thinking, my God, now I'm going to have to write another terrific play? You didn't?
Not at all. In fact, I had already done some sort of first draft of a short play called The Real Inspector Hound. But now, you know, I guess it must have been the summer of '68. You know, now I could afford to rent a bungalow and go and write my play with my family there and everything. That's what I did. But I discovered, I mean, later, much later, because in fact, the next time I produced a script, which was a full-length play, it was called Jumpers. Jumpers was put on in '72, so in other words, it was kind of like a 5-year gap. And I know my sweet agent, my friend Ken Ewing, the late Ken Ewing, I learned subsequently that they were in the office, they were saying, well, why isn't he writing another play? It never occurred to me there was any hurry about that.
Yeah,
but that's what happened.
So in the last 50 years, there have been innumerable productions of Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, and many, many productions of many of your other plays, and you're often involved in these new productions. So recently there have been, for instance, revivals of Indian Ink and The Real Thing in New York, and there was a revival of Hapgood at the Hampstead Theatre, and there's going to be a new production of Travesties coming, I gather. So when that happens, does it take you back to the period in your life when you wrote the play? Does it act as a sort of trigger when you're in rehearsal watching somebody do a new production of that play? Do you think back to the time when you wrote it?
Well, in some cases, more than in others. This is all a bit premature, really, but never mind, it's only us. You know, Travesties has been directed by Patrick Marber, who's a very good director as well as being a very good playwright. And he wants to put things back, which I shortened. There's a section, there's a catechism section where James Joyce and Tristan Zara are having a conversation for reasons which really you don't want me to explain. The whole scene is written in the form of the Christian catechism, question and answer, which itself was the template for a chapter in Ulysses. So that's what I was doing. I was doing a Ulysses bit. And it was obviously far too long for its own good, and was done in a kind of Joycean, jokey way. I wish I could convey it. Well, a question would be, by what term denoting amicability and age did R refer to Zara? And the answer would be good old Zara. I mean, that kind of joke, you know, silence reigns. That's all right. So I'll get there in a minute, Hermione.
It's fine.
The point is that this Q&A was too long for its own good, and so there's various editions of this play in print, and there's one where it's shorter. Patrick has got hold of every edition, and he wants to bring back bits he liked, which I'd not only cut, but forgotten about years ago. Should I tell you about Cecily's lecture?
Yes.
Okay, I'll pretend that nobody knows about this. The very first time this play was done, and it's a very light-hearted play, and there's a scene done in limerick form, and most of the first act is modelled on the importance of being earnest. So it's all kind of fun stuff. And then there's an interval, and after the interval there's a young librarianess who is a kind of acolyte or satellite of Lenin, who was also in Zurich at that time, along with Tristan Tzara and James Joyce. And this librarianess, who's called Cecily, I gave her a 3-page speech, which very sort of without, fairly fully, told the story of Bolshevism from the moment Das Kapital was published until Lenin arrived from Zurich at the Finland station. And to my mind, it was very funny because, well, it was a very private joke, because I thought they're all going out, I think, into the interval, ordering gin and tonic, thinking, oh, it's a rather fun, darling, don't you think? And then they'd come back, and they'd be saying, what? As this endless monologue unrolls, without any jokes in it. But however, the Lord was looking after me. Cecily got a sore throat, whether it was a diplomatic sore throat or not. So we actually, when it came to it, we did the first paragraph of this interminable monologue. We did the last paragraph and got on with the play. So that's the end of paragraph 1. Then what happened was, a year later, the play was going to be done in Paris. And the director called me and said, I'm doing your play, and it's great, and is there anything you want to tell me? And I said, no, it's just... I said, no, hang on a minute. Cecily's lecture, you really don't have to use all of that. And he said, mais non, c'est magnifique. And I said, believe me, I've been there. We began with the last paragraph, and really, you should do that too. And he said, non, j'adore, je l'adore. So I thought, sur votre tête be it optimal. So months go by, and we have another conversation. The play's opened, seems to have gone fine, and he was telling me about it on the phone, and I said, and what about Cecily's lecture? Ah, formidable. And I'm thinking, this is a bloody kind of audience I deserve. And then I went to Paris to have a look, and it was absolutely true what he said. She did the whole thing. You could have heard a pin drop, but he hadn't mentioned that she was stark naked. She got out of bed with no clothes on and started on my monologue. Naturally, gave it every attention. And then she slowly started putting her underwear on while she kept talking about, what happened in the Zimmerwald conference of 1924 or something. And finally, she got to the end and she was dressed. That was sort of rather wonderful theatre. Brilliant. Actually, do you remember Brecht's Galileo? There's a wonderful scene in Galileo where he gets put into his robes while he's speaking. So he begins as this bloke and ends up as the Pope. It's a wonderful idea.
This is a great story. Just the thing about changes, it's very interesting. I mean, most people in this room have seen or worked on or own copies of your plays. We've probably all got a copy of Arcadia in our room that's very precious to us. You seem to be saying that, and something of that you were saying last night, that things can change, that there's no such thing as a sacred text. And
well, there is for other writers, I think.
But isn't there for you? Wouldn't you mind? I mean, if an actor's doing your play and they get the lines wrong, don't you mind?
Oh, crikey, I see what you mean. Yeah, of course I do. What I mean is, it's fine if I change it. I misunderstood you. Yes. The text is sacred until I change it. I don't actually want actors to decide that there's another way of doing this.
But you change things Why? Because plays change historically, so that a play that you've written in the 1970s might feel very differently now, or because in rehearsal of a new production of a play you'll think this bit needs cutting or isn't as clear as I want it to be. How, you know, are the changes always to do with clarity or structure, or?
I think any good reason to change is a good reason, and it could be any of those things. There are things which you think are kind of rather funny and clever and nice jokes in one decade, and then 2 decades go by and you don't feel like that anymore about that particular line, and you're quite glad to see the back of it. You know, when I did a film, I was only once in the position of having my own film, a film of my own play, and at the time, the film, you know, at the time I was editing it to deliver the film, I ended up with a cut where, for the life of me, I couldn't see where I would take out 5 seconds. You know, everything was tight, but there was no way I could ever. And then this year was its 25th anniversary, and they were reissuing it as a DVD. My children used to say that nothing very much happened in my film. My children, who were at that sort of age where they would say that sort of thing, claimed that you could actually get a copy of my film at the garage if you bought 15 litres of petrol, or you could choose between mine and Heaven's Gate or something like that. Anyway, the thing is that this year's 25th anniversary, and they reissued it, and we did stuff. And when I watched it, I badly wanted to take 10 minutes out of it, and could. I knew exactly what I wanted to do to it, which was to take this, that, or... so everything was the same, except 25 years had gone by, and instead of being unable to take out 10 seconds, I could take out 10 minutes. Unfortunately, I wasn't allowed to. It's too expensive. But I don't know if that answers the question in any way.
It does. It's just this thing about looking back on work that you've done and thinking, you know, oh, I wish I could have lost 10 minutes there, or I'd like to change a line, or cut this bit, or change it. I mean, do you not ever look back on your own work and think that was perfect?
Well, you think twice before acceding to something which sounds incredibly vain, but how can I put this? There are certain things just here and there, which in a way, which for me is an affirmation about some secret in the creative process. There are some things here and there which are actually better than I am.
Can you give an example?
No. No, I couldn't.
No?
I couldn't.
So this isn't a whole play?
No, it's a speech here and a speech there. And you just somehow are given access to a form of words and the thought. Could I tell, you know my story about Belinsky in Place of Utopia? Can I say about that? Belinsky was we're talking about Russia in the 1830s. Belinsky was a youngish man who was ill. He was a literary critic. I know about him because I was really writing about a man called Alexander Herzen, who was perhaps the favorite dead person of Isaiah Berlin. Herzen and Bukhanin and other people were in Paris. Herzen was, as it were, in self-exile. Belinsky, who had TB, went to a German spa, which he was allowed to do, but everything was very, very difficult for him, and it was a very tight autocracy he was living in. He'd written a play when he was a student. So this is what he's... You know, I know this is weird, but I think I invented this, and if I didn't, then I found it in something of Belinsky's, and I actually forgot which. But anyway, what he says is about himself. What he says is, you know, I wrote a play, tried to write poetry. It was no good. It was no good. He said, when you can watch a real poet at work, and you can see him sitting at a table with a pen in his hand, and the pen is moving, and then it stops, and then it moves again. And Belinsky says, where did he go in that moment? And it's true, you go in that moment to a place which, as it were, reformulates you in a way that makes it possible to write the next bit. And sometimes that next bit you feel is pretty good.
But when Belinsky's saying that, and when you're, as it were, having him say that, you're not of the school, are you, that says somehow the writing makes itself, somehow it comes out of some unconscious place that you're not fully in control of, the characters take on a life of their own, all that.
Yeah.
You don't really say that, do you?
No, I don't. But I do say that the characters keep telling you where the play goes next, which is not the same thing.
No, sure.
I mean, writing plays is actually some kind of poise or balance between the utterance and the situation. And it's probably true that progressively I demand to know less about the situation in advance, and the characters, or indeed where the story has got to. It just tells you what would be good to happen next. And if you'd sort of worked that out before you started, you'd find, well, you'd get into trouble, in my opinion.
That's not to say you haven't done a lot of reading before you start, or a lot of thinking.
Well, if the play is about something which requires a lot of reading, you know, if you write a play about a living or person who was living, I wrote a play about A.E. Housman, which was actually done here by students at the Oxford Playhouse about 3 years ago. If you're writing about somebody like A.E. Housman, who was a classical scholar as well as a poet, you could spend an awful long time reading him and about him. But in that case, I found it very enjoyable and absorbing, and had to kind of stop myself reading.
But do you also have to stop yourself reading because there might be a point when you've read too much? Or
no,
it's not that.
I'd said that I'll give you a play in October, and so on, and suddenly it's March and you haven't started because the reading has been so enjoyable.
Okay.
And I wanted to do the play for Richard Eyre, who was leaving the National Theatre in a certain month, and in fact this was his last play that he did there. And actually the same thing happened with Nick Heitner. It was his last play, the play I wrote. The play What I Wrote.
I want to come back to, actually you just mentioned the student production, I want to come back to that whole area of the way your work's taken over and done. But I just wanted to pause a bit longer on this question of time and links between the past and the present. So it strikes me and anyone who reads you that over time that there are connections in subjects that preoccupy you or that you come back to. I don't mean to say that you are a repetitive playwright, because you're not. But so, for instance, the argument about, let me just give one example, the argument about the nature of good and whether there's anything beyond, as it were, the machine, or whether there is such a thing as some kind of soul or innate goodness that can't be accounted for by mechanics. It comes in Jumpers when George Moore's talking about the idea of goodness as a moral absolute. It comes in the arguments between Max and Lenker in Rock and Roll. It comes in The Hard Problem. And the philosophy student Emily in your radio play Dark Side in 2013 says, what I'm thinking is you can't work out what is the good. You just know what is the good. That's what's good about it. So that's something that keeps coming back to you. Why maybe why is the wrong question, but well, why do you think it does keep coming back? What is it about that whole idea about goodness and our natures that preoccupies you?
It's like a brute fact in my consciousness. It just has done since I was able to have that kind of a thought. And it seems, I think it's because it just seems important to me. All these, a question like, what is the good, and how do you validate one idea of good against another, and is there an idea which actually overrides and is supreme above all lower versions of the answer to what is good? All such matters, and when I say all such matters, I mean what is true of morality is true of aesthetics. You know, what is beautiful is the same problem. And I think what unites everything in my interest or in my nature or my soul, I don't know, is that the very notion of there being a definitive answer to the question, that very notion entails that materialism as a philosophy is too reductive, or reductive in the wrong way. The idea of there being a metaphysical good is an affront to physics, and the orthodox wisdom of our time is that everything resolves to physics but no further. You know, it goes, as it were, through chemistry, but in the end it's neurons. And I've never managed to get past a question she asks in this play, The Hard Problem, which Hermione has referred to. So she's in dispute, if you like, with somebody else. And the play is actually about the possibility of altruism, an altruism which isn't self-serving, which doesn't have a secret agenda. Mother love would be an example of where you might argue the point. Is the instinct of a mother towards her baby something ultimately metaphysical, or is it one of the many expressions of the idea of the selfish gene, you know? And I suppose in the end, it's something in one's character which makes one embrace one version of that and slightly recoil from the other version of an explanation.
Yes.
And in the case of this character, she recoils, and she seems to need metaphysics to provide, and this is the paradox, to provide a solid foundation for living. Slightly kind of lost track of where that sentence began.
Can I butt into it? Because there's a question about then loading the dice. So you were talking a bit last night about how much the author in a play, as opposed to a novel or a poem, channels themselves through their characters. So is there a thing you do, for instance, in The Hard Problem, where you channel your view of this, your innate, what you call something in your temperament or your character, which makes you come down on one or other side of these arguments? So that there are characters in the plays, and it may not only be about this, but in other matters too, who are sort of channeling you, who are, you're loading the dice, or you're making them speak for you. Do you do that?
Yeah, but actually, very often, I have to, when there is an argument, obviously I have to provide both sides of it. You know, in travesties, James Joyce, or let's forget any particular way, but, you know, if there's an argument about art and society, I might have a view about what art is, and somebody else might have a view that actually art is the way art expresses dialectical materialism, just like everything else. You know, a particular period of this or that in art. So I was saying, doing this so badly. What I'm trying to say is, there is no play if I'm not doing both sides of the argument. And that's quite good exercise for me.
So you'd rather, if we're watching a play by Tom Stoppard, that we don't know while we're watching the play where you might stand?
No, I don't think I can't stand that up. It's kind of obvious, I think. So Hermione was referring to something I said last night about, you know, your writing. Play is only character and dialogue. There ain't anything else apart from the stage directions. So, since they're characters talking to each other, it really shouldn't implicate necessarily the presence of the author's character. But of course it does. Otherwise, all plays would sound like each other, insofar as there aren't actually that many characters out there. There's this limited number of characters who show up in innumerable plays. So why don't the plays sound broadly like each other? And they sound nothing like each other. So that you wonder, well, look, if Noel Coward wrote a play about two tramps on a country road, what would that sound like? Well, the answer is it would sound like Noel Coward. And not that doesn't... Beckett. What? Not like Beckett. They know who wrote that. It would not be the first time I've overestimated my audience. Anyway, yeah. And, you know, so what's going on, actually, isn't what we conventionally take to be going on. The authorial voice is in the character, no matter how little the character ostensibly resembles the author.
I just want to jump to another way of coming at this very fascinating relationship between the play as a thing and the person behind it. And it's just come up in something you were saying as an example about mother love and altruism. So something that, just like this question of goodness, something that comes up a lot in different ways in the plays is a vulnerable child, or a child who is at the mercy of forces around him or her. Every good boy deserves favour, professional foul. A child that's a kind of pawn in a game, somebody else's game, as in Hapgood. Or a child that has got a lost parent, may not know it's got a lost parent. The parent may have identified the child, but the parent can't identify him or herself to the child, as in Hard Problem. So it's very clear that that's a subject that returns, and I wonder why.
Well, I think it's very clever of you, because it's never occurred to me that was a, what do you call it, a theme, or and you wonder why, right? This is a question which can only be answered lying on a chaise longue, isn't it? But across my heart, it hadn't occurred to me. So you know, I and my mother and my brother, we were in Singapore when the Japanese arrived, and women and children got on boats. The men stayed up. My Czech father was actually on the last boat, but he was killed and the boat was bombed and so forth. So but we didn't know about that until much, much later when we were in India. So maybe there's something in, so I was, if you like, I was fatherless between the age of 4 and 8. And then I had a stepfather whose name I now have. All I can say is that it never occurred to me that I wanted to explore that. It pops up. So my name is my stepfather's. My Czech name was Strausler. And I'm dimly aware, I can't give you chapter and verse, but I'm dimly aware that people are continually getting each other's names wrong in my work. Somebody called Moon is called something else. Mr. Melon is called Lemon. I don't know what's going on. I mean, obviously, on my level, I know what's going on. I'm just trying to be, just keep the thing vaguely alive, you know. So it's not just coming out featureless.
You've segued into name changing from this question of a vulnerable child. So I'll just pull you back one more time and then let it go, which is, I think it has to do with the question in my mind about the way you have sometimes been described or were described in the past, which is sort of a brilliantly dazzling ventriloquist, a sort of heartless showman of the English language, who, you know, firing on all cylinders and dazzling the audience with difficulty and brilliance. And then maybe at a certain point in your writing career that shifts and you become treated as a sort of more heartfelt and tender writer of the feelings, writer of the emotions. Now, you may not recognise that description at all, but you must be dimly aware that something like that has gone on in the way that your work has been received. But the theme of the child, for instance, goes back quite a long way. And I would be myself resisting that idea that you suddenly changed in mid-career and become less pyrotechnical and more feeling. So it's perhaps not something you'd want to answer, really, but someone else might have to answer it.
I've got no objection to answering if I had an answer. I mean, I recognize some truth in this general idea that I think I just lost my shyness at a certain point, became less guarded, became more, to hell with it as an attitude. But actually, I think there's a more professional answer to that, and it is that I kind of understood that emotion is actually the most powerful force in drama. I tended to write, and I still do, tended to write on some level or another comedy, even when it's not ostensibly a comedy. I tended to write in a way which made you laugh or smile periodically, and then that laugh becomes something important in production. You don't want to lose it, so it seems more important than it ought to. I'm aware of all that, so I think in the first part of my life as a writer, I think I thought of myself as somebody who was there to amuse. And then, bit by bit, I just sort of twigged that whereas the production of, let's say, a production of Jumpers, if a production of Jumpers somehow got some rhythm wrong or some level of reality wrong and didn't make anybody laugh or hardly at all, the damage to the event would be enormous. Whereas if a play which was ultimately, there's a play called Rock and Roll, which, you know, does make you laugh now and again, I think. It does, or did anyway. But what made it work, I realized, actually I either received or read a letter by somebody who went home in tears about the fate of the characters. Well, you'd never ever go home in tears about the fate of the characters in Jumpers. You know, they exist to put their foot on a tortoise and smash it by mistake. They exist to shoot an arrow randomly and kill their pet rabbit. You see what I mean? That's what they're for, and coupled with their rather kind of chop logic and arguments about this or that, and certainly about what is the good. But with rock and roll, there's a lot about politics, around about 1968, and there's quite a lot about rock and roll. But in the end, there's this strange little love story in it, which I didn't even recognize and completely mismanaged, in that it's off stage for decades and has to somehow come back alive. And it did, to my astonishment. I mean, I wanted it to by then, but I thought I'd blown it. But no. This is, you know, to actually just pick up from your question rather than answer it.
No, it does.
I think somebody who says that, and they say it a lot, somebody who says that as a playwright, you know, I'd found my mind early, but I found my heart much later. That seems to me a completely intelligible remark. But I don't mean this in any unkind way. It doesn't interest me. I'm not interested. Obviously, one's duty is to write as well as you possibly can, and to write whatever it is that you are now in a state, in a fit state to write. I'd like to write another. To tell you the truth, you know, ever since a play like Travesties or Jumpers, I would like to write another of those, a sort of firework display of nonsense and comedy and song and jokes. I don't think that I'm able to now. And the last play I wrote was a kind of a smallish play with no, I didn't even personally put any music into it, did I?
No, there was music put in.
There was music put in, yeah.
I know people want to ask you questions. I'm just going to ask a couple of shortish, as it were, bridge questions to let you all in. And it's a question about productions and about student productions. I'm sure that there are people in this room who are doing a student production possibly at this very moment or have done. How much involved have you been with that side of the presentation of your work? How often do you go and see a student production? How much sort of help do you give? And do you think there are plays of yours that are sort of favourite plays for productions within universities or colleges?
Well, I came to The Invention of Love Here, which I think must have been 3 years ago, because it's a play which isn't done very often, and I'm fond of it, and also the people who put the play on had been in correspondence with me and so on. But I'm afraid this, the sad answer is not at all, especially the older I get, the less time there is. I don't even like going back. I mean, to be honest, even getting involved in a revival of a play now, it's inconvenient. I really would like to be looking forward, not backward. And I've got very little curiosity about revisiting my plays in productions here and there. I'm very closely involved, obviously, the first time the play is done, and by a kind of knock-on effect, that tends to be true of the first American production. But then, the play gets to be done in Australia. I don't go. I mean, I love Australia as it happens, but I did go. Did you happen to notice that Yukio Ninagawa died very recently? His obituary was in the paper a few days ago. He was a great Japanese director who did the Coast of Utopia in Tokyo, which I did go to. A wonderful man and a very wonderful production. But that is...
But time is too short.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.